The D-Day on Saipan didn't pass according to plan. The beachhead was far from secure. Except for the 4th Marines Division, 23rd Marines and the southern flank of the 25th Marines, all other units failed to reach their objectives, set for the D-Day. By nightfall, both Marine divisions secured less than half the planned beachhead. As the night fell, a Fetner point, still held by the Japanese, separated two divisions. The Japanese artillery fire swept the beach from one end to another, as the Marines dug in and prepared for the night. On the north, the 2nd Marine Division faced the heaviest resistance, and was under constant pressure by the Japanese 136th Infantry Regiment. On the south, the 4th Marine Division faced the 47th Independent Brigade. Continuous fighting, probes and small Japanese counterattacks lasted throughout the night. Supported by the artillery, which landed during the day, and naval gunfire, Marines repelled all Japanese attacks. At 3 a.m., the newly arrived troops of the 135th Regiment reinforced the 136th, and immediately, they launched the attack on the 6th Marines position. Again, Marines repelled the attack, inflicting heavy casualties on the enemy. The first daylight of June 16, 1944, revealed that the thin American line still held on, as well as the result of a night battle of about 700 dead Japanese. The new day also brought some relief among Marines. Nevertheless, the Marines were fully aware that battle had just begun, and that heavy fighting awaited them. The main American objective for the second day was to consolidate the beachhead and close the gap between the two divisions. By noon, the 8th Marines accomplished this task by taking a Fetner point, which proved to be a much easier task than expected. Most Japanese defenders pulled back during the night, and the 8th Marines had to deal with only a few remaining scattered defenders. The rest of the 2nd Marine Division made no advance during the day. Instead, they strengthened their positions and prepared for further Japanese counterattacks, on which they didn't have to wait for long. In the evening, the 136th Regiment, supported with artillery and tanks, launched an attack against the line held by the 6th Marines. In the battle that followed, the largest tank battle in the Pacific Theater, Marines destroyed 24 out of 37 Japanese tanks, inflicting more than 300 casualties to the attacking force. With the gap on their flank closed, the 4th Marine Division continued to advance with all battalions in line, aiming to clear the southern part of the island. As they approached Oslito airfield, the men of the 25th Marines encountered a well-prepared Japanese defensive line, supported with anti-aircraft guns, which halted the division's advance. As the darkness fell, the division dug in for the night. Unlike the 2nd Division sector, the night in the 4th Division zone passed relatively quietly. On the second day, the main problem Marines faced was enemy artillery fire. None of the units on the shallow beachhead escaped the Japanese well-directed artillery and mortar shelling from positions emplaced behind the ridgeline that divides the island. The American artillery units suffered the most. After every American salvo, Japanese forward observers would direct the artillery fire on Marine batteries that didn't have a place to hide. Meanwhile, a greater danger was approaching the Marianas. During the day, Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, received worrying news about the movement of the Japanese fleet from Philippine waters. While the invasion of Saipan was in full swing, on the sea, historical events began to unfold. On June 13, the Japanese First Mobile Fleet, under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, departed Tawi-Tawi, consisting of 9 aircraft carriers with 473 aircraft, 5 battleships, 13 cruisers, 28 destroyers and many more submarines and supporting vessels, and headed towards the Marianas. Initially, Ozawa's task was to reinforce Biak Island. However, after receiving the news about the invasion of Saipan, the Imperial Japanese Navy changed his objective. He received orders to implement the AGO plan, and engaged the US invasion fleet in a decisive battle. The success of the Japanese plan rested on the surprise they hoped to achieve by slipping undetected into the Philippine Sea. Afterwards, they intended to launch an attack with carrier and land-based aircraft, in repeated sorties against the Americans. The first part of their plan failed very soon, as the Japanese fleet steamed through San Bernardino Strait, between Samar and Luzon. The US submarines, patrolling the area, spotted the enemy ships and continued to report their progress as they moved eastward. After receiving reports about the arrival of the Japanese fleet, Admiral Spruance estimated that Ozawa's carriers could be in a position for an attack as early as the final hours of June 17, and that they would be ready to attack the invasion fleet no later than June 19. After a conference with his staff, and careful consideration of the problem, he made a few decisions. The first decision was to postpone landing on Guam, scheduled for June 18. Also, after consultation with General Holland Smith, they both agreed that 27th Division should land on Blue Beach, as they considered that they would be more valuable on the ground than packed on the transport ships. All transport ships of the Southern Attacking Force, and transports not required for Saipan landings, received orders to retreat further to the east. Escort carriers, providing air cover for the ground forces on Saipan, were to take the position on the eastern side of the island. Spruance also had other problems. When the pre-invasion bombardment of Marianas began, he learned that the Japanese were sending a great number of planes from the home islands to Chichi and Iwo Jima, about 1,000 kilometers to the north. These planes presented a danger for the shipping off Saipan. On June 15, he ordered Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of the powerful Task Force 58, to send 2 carrier task groups to launch the strikes against Iwo and Chichi-jima. The 2 task groups were to hit the islands for 2 days, June 16 and 17, and then rejoin Task Force 58 off Saipan. Now, he desperately needed these carriers back. Meanwhile, on Saipan, heavy fighting still raged on. In the early morning of June 17, the 27th Division began to land. The 165th Infantry Regiment came ashore on Blue Beach, and proceeded inland to reinforce the 4th Marine Division, in clearing the southern part of Saipan. In the evening, 105th Infantry Regiment and the division headquarters joined them, while the 106th Regiment remained afloat as the Corps Reserve. The 2nd Marine Division, after repelling the Japanese tank attack the previous night, during the day, pushed Japanese forces north, and doubled its beachhead area. 2nd Marines advanced towards Garapan. The 6th Marines secured the top of Tipo Pale, while the 8th Marines moved around Lake Susup, in the waist-deep swamp, full of Japanese snipers. On the south, the 4th Marine Division made even better progress. Reinforced with 165th Infantry Regiment, the 25th Marines gained the northwest edge of Aslito airfield. Meanwhile, the 23rd Marines made limited progress during the day, suffering equally from enemy fire and swamps of Lake Susup. As usual, the night on Saipan didn't pass quietly. The Japanese troops launched multiple small-scale attacks, attempting to find a weak spot in the American line, inflicting casualties among Marines and Army troops. At 10 a.m., on June 18, the major American offensive to clear the southern part of the island began. On the north, the 2nd Marine Division made only a slight advance, partly because they held an overextended line, and partly because they faced resolute defenders. Attack of the 4th Marine and 27th Infantry Division was more successful. The 23rd Marines finally fought their way out of swamps, while the 25th Marines reached Margisiane Bay, cutting the island in two. On the southeast, the 27th Infantry Division overrun a Sleto airfield without opposition, leaving many Japanese troops cut off on Lofoten Point. While the ground troops advanced steadily, the main concern for the Americans was the approach of the Japanese fleet. Two carrier task groups that attacked Iwo and Chichijima had returned after a successful mission and rejoined Task Force 58. During the night, Admiral Mitcher, anxious to get at the Japanese, tried to persuade Spruance to move his task force to the southwest and engage the Japanese at the earliest opportunity. Mitcher thought that the Japanese held an advantage, as they could launch their carrier planes from 1,000 kilometers out, attack the 5th Fleet, land and refuel on Guam, attack again, and fly back to their carriers. On the other hand, the Americans could not reach Japanese carriers if they remained near the Marianas, due to the limited operating radius of Navy planes. Spruance considered the safety of the invasion forces as his main task, and refused Mitcher's advice, ordering him to remain near the invasion forces. On June 19, Marines and Army troops carried out small-scale offensive actions to consolidate the positions gained the previous day and further expand the beachhead, fighting the enemy that had already suffered significant losses. However, the successful ground actions on Saipan were overshadowed by the events that took place in the skies over the Philippine Sea. With the first light of June 19, everyone knew that the Japanese fleet was in position, and that attack was imminent. Search planes took off from American carriers, and headed southwest, unsuccessfully trying to find the Japanese fleet. At 6:19 a.m., Spruance ordered Task Force 58 to change course westward, to get closer to the approaching enemy, unaware that the Japanese fleet was more than 600 kilometers away, still beyond the range of his aircraft. On the other side, a Japanese air search had a much easier task, to locate the American fleet. In the early morning hours, Japanese successfully revealed the location of Task Force 58. Acting on this information, at 8:30 a.m., Admiral Ozawa launched his first attack wave of 45 dive bombers, 8 torpedo planes and 16 fighters. U.S. Navy planes intercepted the first Japanese wave over Guam, destroying 27 Japanese aircraft, in the first of many dogfights that raged over the Philippine Sea during the day. At 9:37 a.m., radar operators on the American ships picked up the second, much larger wave of 47 Japanese fighters and 61 dive bombers and torpedo planes, 200 kilometers west. General quarters was sounded, and all hands went to their battle stations. Deck crews worked quickly, knowing that every minute was precious. Admiral Mitcher, who was in tactical command of all aviation assets, ordered all dive bombers and torpedo planes to take off and orbit east of Guam. This way, he kept the carrier decks free to land, service, and launch fighters, and at the same time, he wanted to spare these planes of potential losses, knowing that he would need them later for an attack on the Japanese fleet. Soon, 450 fighter planes took off to intercept the attacking Japanese. American fighters dived on the enemy formation, 100 kilometers away from their targets. In the dogfights that followed, the U.S. Navy planes and pilots proved to be much superior to the Japanese. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was on the way. New American Hellcat fighters, overgunned and overmaneuvered, once fearsome Japanese Zeros. Many U.S. pilots became ace in a day, shooting 5 or more planes in only one sortie. Only a handful of Japanese planes broke through the wall of Navy fighters and reached the American ships. The anti-aircraft fire brought those few down with ease. Throughout the day, the Japanese repeatedly launched airstrikes against the invasion fleet. Each time the U.S. Navy pilots would shoot them out of the sky. A third and fourth Japanese wave met the same fate. Overall, the Japanese lost 385 planes, for the cost of 40 Hellcats. It was the greatest aerial victory in the Pacific War. During all of this fighting, the U.S. submarines had their feast. SS Albacore sneaked close to the Japanese fleet, and fired a salvo of torpedoes, hitting a brand new 31,000-ton carrier, Taiho. Shortly after, SS Kavala launched 6 torpedoes, of which 3 hit their mark, and sunk carrier Shokoku, after the ship suffered a catastrophic explosion of aviation fuel vapor. At approximately 2:30 p.m., Taiho suffered the same fate. The Japanese side was not aware of the true magnitude of the disaster, as Ozawa believed that most of his missing planes had landed on Guam or other airstrips in the area, and would be available for further strikes. The few Japanese pilots that returned from the mission reported that they had sunk 4 American carriers, and that 6 more were heavily damaged. These reports gave the Japanese side unrealistically high hopes of ultimate victory, although they have lost 2 aircraft carriers, and almost 3,000 men aboard them. However, the night revealed the scale of the Japanese catastrophe. Out of the 473 Japanese planes that took off, by the end of the day, less than 100 were still operational. Therefore, Ozawa decided to abandon further attacks, and headed for Okinawa. While the Japanese decided to withdraw, Spruance and Mitchell didn't want to miss the opportunity to deal a deadly blow to the remaining Japanese fleet. Throughout the night of June 19, Task Force 58 steamed west to get close to the Japanese. In the afternoon on June 20, a message came from one of the search planes that the Japanese fleet had been sighted 450 kilometers west of Saipan, steaming northwest. Now the time came for the Americans to strike back. A few minutes after receiving the report, Mitchell ordered to launch all his planes into the attack on the Japanese fleet. Within minutes, 216 aircraft took off from their carriers, but when the strike flight was on its way, the search planes sent a corrected position report, placing the Japanese fleet 100 kilometers farther west, which meant that planes would have to fly to the target, attack the enemy fleet before darkness, and fly back to the carriers in the dark, at a distance that almost exceeded the limit of their operational range. Mitchell knew for sure that some planes would have to land in the water at night, but there was no turning back, as the price of success was more important than potential losses. The only thing he could do was increase the speed of his ships and steam west. It was already dusk when the American planes finally approached their target, finding the Japanese fleet divided into 3 groups. To preserve precious fuel, they had dived into the 2 nearest groups, attacking through thick anti-aircraft fire. About 75 Japanese fighters took off from the carriers to intercept incoming American bombers, and Hellcat fighters immediately attacked them before they reached slow and vulnerable bombers, shooting them out of the sky. Only 10 Japanese planes survived the dogfight. Dive bombers and torpedo planes attacked their primary targets, the aircraft carriers. The carrier Hyo was attacked and hit by bombs and aerial torpedoes, sinking shortly after a tremendous blast from leaking aviation fuel. Some bombs hit and severely damaged the carriers Zuikoku, Junyo, and Chiyoda, but they managed to get back to the homeland. 2 bombs hit battleship Haruna. All in all, Americans managed to sink 3 aircraft carriers, 2 fleet oilers, and destroyed almost all carrier-based planes. After a successful mission, in which Americans lost 20 aircraft, to Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire, it was time for return. Many pilots anxiously looked at their fuel indicators and wondered whether they would reach the safety of their decks. Pitch-black darkness had already descended as the first returning planes appeared over the horizon. Many of them were running dangerously low on fuel. Knowing that aviators would have difficulty finding their carriers, the captain of the USS Hornet decided to illuminate his carrier, shining searchlights directly up into the night, despite the risk of attack from Japanese submarines and night-flying aircraft. Mitscher instantly backed up the decision, and soon every ship in Task Force 58 was lit up. Returning planes were given clearance to land on any closest available flight deck, and many did land on other carriers. Even in perfect conditions, landing at night on the flight deck is a challenging task. Therefore, many planes crash-landed, making some decks temporarily unusable. Several aircraft ran out of fuel and had to ditch in the sea. Most pilots and aircrews that ended in water were picked up from the sea the following day. Task Force 58 tried to chase the Japanese fleet throughout the following day, June 21st, but they were always beyond their combat radius. Finally, Mitscher gave up the pursuit and headed back towards Saipan. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was the largest carrier-to-carrier battle in history. Americans lost 123 aircraft, 16 pilots and 33 aircrewmen. Out of many surface vessels, only one battleship was damaged. For the Japanese, the result of the battle ended up in disaster. Out of the 9 aircraft carriers the Japanese had, when the Battle of the Philippine Sea started, only 2 remained seaworthy. They have lost almost all fleet planes and approximately 3,000 men. Meanwhile, on Saipan, Marines and Army troops continued their advance, unaware of the events that took place hundreds of kilometers away on the sea. On June 20th, after massive artillery preparation, the 8th Marines secured Hill 500, suffering only light casualties. The men of the 27th Infantry Division pushed the Japanese further south, on the rugged ground of Nafuten Point. In the morning, the 106th Infantry Regiment came ashore. The following day, Marines cleared swamps of Lake Susup, and regrouped for an advance into central Saipan, scheduled for June 22, while the 27th Infantry Division slowly fought its way through the caves and ravine of Nafuten Point. By then, the 2nd Marine Division had already suffered 2,514 casualties, the 4th Marine Division lost 3,628, and the 27th Infantry Division lost 320 men, and in front of them still lay hills and valleys of central Saipan.